The first time I began questioning my Christian faith was my final semester in graduate school. I was working on a Master of Arts degree in New Testament and was studying the New Testament in its original language, Greek, for hundreds of hours. I was also praying 1 to 2 hours a day, and I really was enjoying my relationship with God. But then one day I just asked myself the question, how do I know that this is really true? Am I just fooling myself into thinking I've got a relationship with God and that Christianity is true? Maybe it's not true. Maybe people of other religions have it correct. And I was fortunate, blessed, that one of my roommates was doing a master's degree in philosophy and apologetics, and he referred me to one of his professors, Gary Habermas. And I walked into Gary's office and he graciously gave me some of his time and shared some of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I left confident again. And then later on, I began questioning my faith again as I began talking to skeptics, sharing my faith with them, and they were coming up with objections that I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't been interested in apologetics until I became interested in it because I needed it. I needed the answers. And then when I was doing my doctoral work on the resurrection of Jesus, my research on that, I was trying to be as open-minded and neutral as possible. And I began to doubt at that point. And I wanted to conclude my research with as much integrity as possible. And at the end, I felt pretty confident about my conclusions that Jesus had risen from the dead and believed that I had conducted my research with integrity. So I probably wouldn't have any more doubts. Well, I was wrong, because I started to doubt my Christian faith shortly after I completed my doctoral work. And I asked myself, why is it that I'm still doubting? I mean, I've looked at the data. I've looked at it as honestly as possible. My doctoral dissertation was 3 to 4 times longer than the average dissertation. Why was I still doubting? And I got thinking about it. On a stage, I often speak up on a stage, and the event organizers will place little pieces of tape where the lighting stops and tell you you're not to go outside of this boundary because the lights won't be shining on you properly. And there's usually about 10 or more feet from front to back and maybe 30, 40, 50 feet from side to side. It's no problem to do that. I could do it blindfolded. I could jog backwards with my eyes closed and never go outside of that boundary. But you take that same boundary of from front to back 10 feet, but extend it longer, maybe 500 feet or maybe 100 yards, and then place it 1,000 feet above the ground, suspended between 2 skyscrapers, and no way I'm going to cross that. Well, why not? I know I can. Yes, I can. It wouldn't be a problem. But it's the what if. What if I fall? The consequences are too great. Well, it's the same thing, my doubts that I had after my doctoral work, and still to this day I have them occasionally. It's not intellectual doubts anymore. They're emotional doubts. What if I'm wrong? Yeah, but Mike, you've looked at all the evidence as honestly as you could. Yeah, I know, but what if I'm wrong? And it's that sometimes keeps me awake at night. It's emotional doubt. And I found that most people who are doubting, it's not due to intellectual doubt, it's emotional doubt. I found the scientific evidence for a creator, a designer of the universe and of life itself to be quite interesting and compelling. I'm not a scientist, so I can only go with what scientists say. So when you have atheist scientists like Richard Dawkins, who says that the universe really has the strong appearance of being designed, or Francis Crick, one of the 2 molecular biologists who discovered DNA, who was an agnostic and bordered on atheism, he said that DNA was so complex that it would be virtually impossible for life, even in its simplest form, to have formed during the time that this Earth has been around, which is estimated to be around 4.5 billion years. So Francis Crick posited that life originated in another planet and came to Earth on a spaceship. So, I mean, that tells you that life is really complex, that the universe does appear to be the product of a designer. And then I like the moral argument. I like the moral argument for God's existence. I don't think it's the strongest argument for God's existence, but I find it compelling. And it goes like this. If God does not exist and we're all here by chance, well, then you got to look and say, we have no more intrinsic value than a fly or a spider or a mosquito. So when you go out to a barn in the countryside on a summer evening and you see an insect that's trapped in a spider web and the spider is preparing to eat it, perhaps you feel a little compassion for the bug that's about to be killed. But you don't think to yourself, well, that's evil. You just say, that's nature. I'm glad I'm not the bug. And in the same way, if God does not exist and we're all here by chance, then what Hitler did to Jews and homosexuals, mentally handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, what he did to all his enemies, you couldn't say that's really wrong. You would only say that that's nature. I'm glad I'm not the victim. But we all know that there are certain things. Deep down inside, we know that torturing little babies for the fun of it is evil. That rape, that cold-blooded murder, it's just evil. It's evil regardless of what a society thinks. And even if everyone in the world thought that it was okay to torture babies, it still wouldn't be. But that can't be unless there is a moral giver, lawgiver, who transcends humanity. And that sounds like God. And then I find the evidence, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus to be quite compelling. So yeah, these three things, and there are other things too, evidence for supernatural dimension of reality, such as near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, extreme answered prayer, paranormal phenomena. These so strongly evidence or point to a spiritual or supernatural dimension of reality that it's really hard once you see the data to deny the existence of the spiritual dimension and still regard yourself as a realist. So I think all these things together strongly suggest that the Christian worldview is correct. There is a lot of opposition to Christianity today in Western culture. We find it attempts to undermine Christianity and the Christian ethic in the media, the news agencies. We find it in universities and even in high schools where they're introducing all sorts of ideas that are against God. A few years ago, there was the movie God Is Not Dead that portrayed a professor who on the first day of class said, "How many of you are Christians?" And a few raised their hand. He said, "My objective is that by the end of this semester, you will no longer be a Christian." And there are some that said, well, that never happens. Well, it does here in the United States, happens all over the country. I've had students all over the United States tell me that that has happened in some of their courses. And then you find it in entertainment. It used to be back in the 50s and even somewhat in the 60s that when they showed the bedroom of a married couple, they slept in separate beds. But not anymore. You not only have that, you have some pretty graphic scenes in some television shows today. I'm not talking about movies, I'm just talking about television shows. And then you have, it's almost like a requirement today that a television series include someone who's at least one person who belongs to the LGBTQ movement. So you have all of this, and it seems to, after a while, this just gets burned into a person's subconscious, and they're thinking, wow, LGBTQ lifestyle is just normal because we see it normalized in our entertainment industry. And so there's a lot of things out there, again, in the media, in entertainment, and in our education institutions that are mounting a war against Christianity. don't overstate your case. You can do this by saying the resurrection is the best attested fact in history, or the resurrection can be proved beyond all doubt. No, the resurrection of Jesus is not the best attested fact in history, and it cannot be proven beyond all doubt, but it doesn't need to be the best attested fact in history or to be proven beyond all doubt. It just has to be that the resurrection of Jesus is strongly supported by a preponderance of evidence. The evidence suggests that it is the best explanation of the data. That's what needs to occur. So don't overstate your case, because if you say the resurrection is the best attested fact in history, let's say, and someone comes back and say, all right, what's your evidence for it? Okay, well, I think we've got some better evidence for the Holocaust, don't you think? And there goes your case for the resurrection of Jesus. So state your case in a good manner, an accurate manner. Don't overstate it. Another thing is, and this is probably the most important of all, who you are and how you communicate will play a significant role in how receptive a person is going to be to your message. So if you are kind and communicate in an intelligent and informed manner, the person with whom you are speaking is going to be far more likely to pay attention and be open to what you say than if you are mean and show ignorance of facts, of things that you should know when communicating these things. So those would be some of the points that I would suggest you keep in mind when you share the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus or the truth of Christianity with someone else. What is sufficient for one person may not be for another. A person who is inclined to think there is a powerful being who created the universe may find the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection persuasive, sufficient. A person who was raised in a strict Muslim family and has been a committed Muslim their entire life, they may not find the same evidence sufficient to change their beliefs. I mean, think about this in the reverse for a moment. Let's say that you as a Christian, what would it take to convince you that Islam is true, or Buddhism or Hinduism is true? It would take a lot, probably more, because you are ingrained in your worldview than, say, someone who is just totally open. They're non-committal on any worldview. Now, some agnostics who are not committed to any worldview can be committed to agnosticism and be stuck there, of course. But it can take a lot, more than just a reasonable amount of evidence that would serve as sufficient amount for a person to change. You know, a few years ago, I debated an atheist, and sometime after our debate, someone posted on Facebook, hey, for you atheists out there, if you knew beyond all doubt that Christianity was true, would you become a follower of Jesus? And the guy I debated just said, no. So for him, there's no amount of evidence that would be sufficient to lead him to belief. My point here is that one's worldview and their biases have tremendous influence on one's decisions. That said, if one approaches the question of Jesus' resurrection with an open mind and give the historical data an honest look, then I think the evidence for Jesus' resurrection may very well be sufficient for that person. However, some may need more evidence before they are persuaded to move, before they become a follower of Christ. Several years ago, Gary Habermas came up with what he refers to as the minimal facts approach. Sometimes he calls it minimal facts method. The minimal facts approach only considers facts that meet two criteria. Number one, they are strongly supported by the data. And number two, a vast majority of critical scholars who study the subject are persuaded by the data and so are willing to grant these as facts. Just for example, Jesus' death by crucifixion. It's strongly supported by the data. I could give you a lot of evidence, historical evidence, that Jesus died by crucifixion. This evidence is so strong, the data is so strong, that the overwhelming majority of critical scholars today, a heterogeneous vast majority, so you've got Christian, you've got conservative, moderate, liberal Christian, agnostic, Jewish, atheist historians, New Testament scholars who study the subject, they all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, of course, you might find a handful who deny it or think that Jesus survived, but out of thousands of scholars, when you only have a handful, you don't tend to pay much attention to them. They're kind of like Holocaust deniers. You have about as many professional historians who reject the Holocaust as you have who say Jesus never existed or died by crucifixion. Okay, so that's a minimal facts approach. You only consider those facts that are so strongly supported by the data that the vast majority of critical scholars grant them as facts. And there are several advantages to the minimal facts approach. I mean, one, it's a whole lot less to remember if you're wanting to share a strong argument for the resurrection of Jesus. But another nice thing about it is, since most people grant these facts, then it's just a matter of what's the best explanation of these facts. So if we know that Jesus' disciples were proclaimed, that they had a sincere belief that Jesus rose and had appeared to them. This is what the overwhelming majority of critical scholars say today. If that's the case, then if someone responds by saying, well, I don't trust the Gospels. Okay, well, do you still think that Jesus' disciples believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them? Okay, because the majority of scholars do. We're not saying it's true because scholars do. It's just they are convinced because the evidence is so strong. So if you grant that they had these experiences, then it won't do to say, well, I don't trust the Gospels. It's irrelevant. You still have to explain the knowable facts. That's the minimal facts approach. One of the most popular opposing theories to the resurrection of Jesus is that Jesus' disciples and the skeptic Paul experienced visions or hallucinations of the risen Jesus. This is quite easily addressed by recognizing that only about 7%, this is from studies by mental health professionals over more than a century now, only about 7% of those who are bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination of that loved one. Yet with the disciples, you have 100%. You also have group experiences. Now, what mental health professionals have learned is that hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality to them. So in that sense, they're like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. You can't do that because the dream is going on in my brain. It's not being experienced by her. She may dream she's in Hawaii. We may dream it simultaneously, but it's not the same dream. And it's the same with hallucinations. They're occurring in the mind of an individual, so you can't have a collective experience. It could be that a bunch of people in a room who are high on drugs will be experiencing hallucinations, but it's not the same one. And then you got the appearance to Paul. Paul was not grieving Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. Perhaps the most popular explanation, alternate explanation to the resurrection, has to do with miracles. They'll say, well, the historian can't adjudicate on a miracle claim because it assumes God's existence and God is beyond what the tools of historians can find. But we don't have to, as historians, assume God's existence. We can just say, well, we're just going to be open to it. We're not going to exclude it. We're not going to assume it. Let's let the evidence point to where it does. And if it really appears that a supernatural, a spiritual event has occurred, and it's extremely unlikely that a natural explanation or a natural cause was involved, then I think we can say that a miracle happened if there's good evidence for it. And of course, that would suggest God's existence. But you don't a priori rule out a miracle because you don't like the idea of God's existence. I've also heard it say that a miracle is the least probable explanation, to which I say least probable in reference to what? Because if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the resurrection of Jesus would have been the best explanation, the most probable explanation of what occurred. So least probable in reference to what? Well, maybe he was raised by natural causes. Okay, I agree, that's the least probable explanation. But if it's by natural causes, it's not a miracle, is it? So it seems like this objection that a miracle by its very definition is the least probable explanation, no, that doesn't fit. That is skewed toward a skeptical mind. And that's weighing in with your worldview, with your skepticism, rather than weighing in with the data. And finally, there's the theological explanation that is given. They'll say, look, if you say Jesus rose from the dead, now you're admitting, that can't happen without God. And so it's a theological explanation, not a historical one. Well, that's not a reason, I would say. That's not a reason to say you can't investigate a miracle claim. I mean, suppose a comet came and crashed in the moon's surface, and some astronomers are watching through a telescope as the lunar dust settles, and they see a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Well, the astronomers would have no idea what caused that message to be written on the moon's surface. They wouldn't have the tools to know whether God did it. They would just have to leave the cause unexplained. But they wouldn't say, well, we can't affirm that the comet crashed on the moon and left this message. Well, of course not. That's undisputed. That would be undisputable. But the cause, they would have to leave a question mark there because scientists don't have the tools to determine God. In the same way, a historian can look at the data and say, there's no plausible natural explanations that can explain this data. In fact, the best explanation by far is that Jesus rose from the dead, and it really appears that this is the case. But the historian couldn't say God raised Jesus, but they could say Jesus was raised. Earlier, you asked for advice pertaining to sharing the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. One of the things I encourage is not to overstate one's case. And while the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead, it does not do so beyond all doubt. I want to offer a similar encouragement with respect to your question, how does the resurrection show us that the Bible is right? Most people will agree that Christianity is true if Jesus truly rose from the dead. And while his resurrection adds plausibility to the truth of many stories in the Bible, such as miracle stories, there is no logical requirement that every story in the Bible is true if Jesus rose from the dead. That's going to have to be argued for separately, the truth of the various stories in the Bible. And in doing so, one is going to have to consider various genres that appear in the biblical literature. These must be taken into consideration, and the reliability of historical reporting in the Bible must be discussed as a separate matter. In 2003, Gary Habermas and I were wrapping up writing our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And I remembered asking Gary, you have made a bibliography of more than 2,000 sources and hundreds of scholars who have written on the resurrection of Jesus since 1975. And they look at the same data but arrive at radically different conclusions. Who are these people studying it? Have they been trained in the philosophy of history and historical method? And he said, by far, most of them are New Testament scholars. And then you have a few philosophers. And hardly any professional historians have published on it. He says there are a handful. And like Paul Meier, he's a professional historian of antiquity. and he did one. Excuse me. But they are short. Not an exhaustive case had been done. And so I thought, well, I'll do that. I'd be curious to know what historical method looks like and what kind of results it would reap if it were applied with integrity to the data. Would it show that Jesus rose from the dead? And so I read well over 100 journal articles and books written by philosophers of history and historical method on how to do history. And then I learned the method and I applied that to the resurrection of Jesus. And so my book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, is a fresh approach to the resurrection of Jesus through the lens of a historian applying historical method. First, I recommend that you read a lot on apologetics. So there are plenty of books out there. Read those books. Be a voracious reader. Second, I'd say watch a lot of debates to see what arguments leading Christian apologists and scholars are using and what their debate opponents are saying in response. You'll find that a seasoned debater has heard a lot of the objections and they've been able to fine-tune their arguments because they're not just preaching to the choir. They've got to provide arguments that are going to stand up to critical scrutiny. So find out what those best arguments are. Third, I'd say role play with others. As you're learning the arguments, role play with others as though having discussions with non-believers and ask for their critical feedback so that you can fine-tune your arguments for Christianity, become a good apologist. Fourth, I'd say resist the temptation to talk too much or require that someone listen to you for too long. People, when you're dealing one-on-one, people want to be involved in the conversation. They don't want to just sit there and listen to someone else. They could do that during a lecture, but not on a one-on-one conversation. And this can be a weakness. This is something I struggled with at first, and I look back on it now with some degree of embarrassment. It's like I had this knowledge and I just wanted to share it, and I'd go and just overwhelm a person as though they're trying to drink from a fire hose. That's not good communication. So give share some things and then ask for their feedback, or they will probably just be interacting. Welcome that interaction. Then I'd say, finally, be authentic. People can almost always tell when you're winging it because you don't know the answer. So admit when you don't know the answer. There's nothing wrong with that. No one can know everything, right? So when you do that, others will appreciate the answers you do provide when you know the answer. So all these things I think can work well to becoming an effective apologist.